What if the weakest number in the entire world turned out to be the deadliest secret anyone had ever ignored? Stick around, because by the end of the story, Kings will be begging a level 12 nobody for his help. His name was Ethan, and the first thing he understood in this new world was that he was dying inside someone else's body. Not literally dying, not yet, but close enough that the difference didn't matter. He woke up on a narrow cot under a scratchy blanket, in a room that smelled like mold and old copper. The number 12 shimmered faintly on the back of his hand, a dull blue mark, tattooed into his very skin. In this world, that number wasn't decoration. It was a verdict. Every person here carried a seal, a number burned into flesh at birth. And that number decided everything. Strength, status, respect. Even whether a soldier survived the front lines or got fed to it as cannon fodder. And 12 sat at the very bottom of that ladder. Ethan lifted his hand and stared at fingers that weren't his own. Thin, young, no calluses, nothing like the hands of the man he used to be. In his old life, those hands had spent 6 years inside a pharmaceutical plant in Boston, mixing compounds, reading formulas, running quality checks. Now those same hands belonged to a starving apprentice nobody wanted. He tried to sit up and nearly collapsed. His muscles trembled at the smallest movement, betraying him with every inch. And in the corner of the room, someone was dying. An old man lay wheezing on a straw mattress, breathing in wet, ragged gasps that filled the silence like a countdown. The body Ethan now wore knew this man instantly, even if his mind didn't. Master Barnaby, the herbalist. The one man in this world who had taken in a boy marked 12, when everyone else had turned their backs. Ethan crawled closer and pressed his ear to the old man's chest. What he heard made his stomach drop. Fluid in both lungs, a gurgling rattle on every inhale. A diagnosis that arrived before he even had time to think it through. Bilateral pneumonia, advanced. Without real medicine, Barnaby had 3 days left, maybe less. And Ethan had nothing. No hospital, no pharmacy, no antibiotics waiting on a shelf. Just a single room that doubled as a workshop and a bedroom, lined with clay pots along every wall. He reached for the nearest jar, almost without thinking, and sniffed it. Mint, then sage, then a strip of pale bark that this world called white bark. But Ethan's mind saw something the apprentice never could. Salicylic acid, the natural precursor to aspirin, sitting right there on a dusty shelf. His hands moved faster than his thoughts, sliding jar to jar, name to name. Camphor, thyme, wormwood, honey sealed in a jug, moonshine in a bottle. He froze at the moonshine. Ethanol, crude, harsh, but an antiseptic all the same. He grabbed a copper basin and rubbed the greenish film crusted along its rim. Patina, copper oxide. Something clicked deep in his memory, something from a different life entirely. This wasn't a laboratory. It was barely a cave with shelves. But it was something, and something was more than nothing. Behind him, Barnaby's breathing hitched, then rattled again, longer this time. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew the formulas. He knew the chemistry cold. What he didn't have was clean equipment, proper instruments, or any idea what infection was eating away at this old man's lungs. A foreign body, a foreign world, a dying man beside him. And all Ethan carried into this nightmare was 6 years at a pharmaceutical plant back in Boston. He shoved open the shutter, and light spilled into the room. Outside stood a wooden town of winding streets and chimney smoke. A man dragged a coal cart down the lane. A woman balanced a bucket on a yoke across her shoulders. The apprentice's memories rose up on their own. This was Lindholm, a border town, and somewhere north a war was tearing through the countryside. People with low seals were dragged to the front as nothing more than cannon fodder. Barnaby's cloudy yellow eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak. Only a wheeze came out. Ethan grabbed the cleanest pot he could find and got to work. He shook out the mint. He wiped the inside with a rag soaked in moonshine. He stoked the coals. He set water to boil. He ground bark into a coarse powder in a stone mortar and poured boiling water over it. An hour later, he strained the mixture through cloth and stirred in honey. Not aspirin, not even cloves. But the salicylates should bring the fever down, at least a little. He lifted the old man's head and fed him the mixture, drop by drop. Barnaby coughed. Liquid ran down his chin. Ethan tried again, slower this time, and the old man finally swallowed. Then he boiled water with thyme and set the steaming pot near Barnaby's face. Thymol, a natural antiseptic drifting straight into damaged lungs. It wouldn't cure him, but it might buy time to breathe easier. Ethan worked until dark, changing compresses, feeding water drop by drop, keeping the steam alive. When he finally sank to the floor beside the mattress, his hands were shaking from pure exhaustion. The number 12 flickered in the dim candlelight on his palm. Any teenager on the street was twice as strong as him. Any soldier could snap his arm without breaking a sweat. But formulas kept spinning through his head anyway. Acetylsalicylic acid needed acetic acid, and there was vinegar in the shop. He needed a distiller, copper tubing, and a specific kind of mold. Bluish-green, growing on stale bread. The exact genus that had changed medicine forever back where he came from. And there, in the corner of the shop, sat a piece of bread already fuzzed with the right color. Ethan sat on a dirty floor in a world without antibiotics, quietly planning how to brew one from moldy bread. In his old life, he'd written technical regulations in an air-conditioned office and drank vending machine coffee. Now he didn't even own a clean rag. Barnaby wheezed through the night, sometimes louder, sometimes softer. By morning, the fever had dropped half a degree. For the first time, his breathing evened out, if only for a while. Without real antibiotics, the infection would come roaring back. But Ethan had bought a day. Maybe two. A neighbor knocked at dawn and handed over a bowl of porridge, because the whole alley already knew Barnaby was dying. The town doctor had told him to pray, which meant medicine here had already given up, which meant no one would stop Ethan from trying something else. It couldn't get any worse. He fed Barnaby half the porridge, then went out back to the wood pile and the rain barrel and the vegetable beds. His borrowed body remembered every herb Barnaby had ever taught him. He found that piece of moldy bread again, held it to the light, examined the ring-shaped growths with the chemist's eye. Without a microscope, he couldn't be certain, but the signs matched what he was hoping for. He cut the top layer away with a knife, dropped it into a clean pot, and poured in warm barley broth. He covered the pot and set it in the warmest corner by the stove. Now he needed to wait 2 days. Better yet, 3. The fungus needed time to multiply, to release whatever it was hiding inside. It might be penicillin, or it might be nothing at all. A lottery, but one with better odds than praying. And on the third morning, everything Ethan had built in the shop would collide head-on with the one thing chemistry can never fix: time. On the third morning, Barnaby died. Ethan woke to silence. The wheezing had simply stopped. He pressed a hand to the old man's chest. Cold. Already cold. The mark on Barnaby's palm had faded, the old man's seal quietly vanishing along with him. This man had fed and sheltered a boy nobody else wanted, and Ethan closed his eyes for him with a stranger's hands. He told the neighbors. An hour later, 2 men carried the body away. One turned back and asked what Ethan planned to do now, since the shop belonged to the master, not the apprentice. Ethan said he would stay. That evening, alone, he aired out the shop, wiped the floor with moonshine, and checked the pot by the stove. Mold was growing. The liquid underneath had turned yellow. Maybe a good sign. Maybe false hope. A knock came just as his candle burned down to a stub. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, hands burned from forge work, eyes raw from crying. In her arms, a boy of about 5, breathing fast and shallow, his face gray as ash. She introduced herself as Helga Bren, a blacksmith's widow, and the boy was her son, Timo. 3 days ago he'd cut his leg. Now the wound was infected, the fever climbing. Every healer in town had already refused. Someone told her old Barnaby had left behind an apprentice. Ethan laid the boy on the table and unwound the dirty rag from his shin. The wound stretched the length of a palm, its edges swollen and purple, oozing yellow-green pus. Red streaks crept up the leg toward the knee. Those streaks meant one thing. The infection had reached the lymph. If it reached the blood, it would be sepsis, and sepsis meant death. Ethan looked at the pot by the stove. 3 days of growth, cloudy liquid, a sour smell. It might work, it might not. But there was no version of tonight where he had a better option. He told Helga he would try, that he couldn't promise anything, but he would do everything he had. She didn't ask about price. She didn't ask about method. She simply nodded. Ethan boiled water, wiped the table down with moonshine, and washed his hands 3 times over. He cleaned the wound slowly from the center outward, pulling away dead tissue and pus while the boy whimpered under his hands. He rinsed it again with moonshine, then boiled water, then moonshine once more. He packed the wound with a dressing of honey, an antiseptic long before anyone had the word for it. On top, crushed yarrow. Plant chemistry the apprentice's body knew by instinct and the chemist's mind knew by name. He bandaged the leg in clean, boiled cloth. Then he turned to the fever. Ground white bark, a smaller dose for a 5-year-old's body. He mixed it with warm water and heavy honey, enough sweetness to hide the bitterness, and fed it to Timo drop by drop. The boy swallowed, barely, but he swallowed. Helga stood beside her son's head, holding his hand, saying nothing. Ethan lifted the cloth from the pot by the stove. A thick bluish-green film covered an amber liquid underneath. The smell was sour and sharp. Outwardly, it matched everything he was hoping for. But without a laboratory, He had no way to know for certain. He filtered the liquid through 7 layers of boiled cloth, changing it twice, until half a cup of clear amber fluid sat in a clean pot. He had no idea of the concentration, no idea if it was pure or a mixture of a dozen things, no idea what dose was safe for a 5-year-old. But he knew this. Without it, the boy had 2 or 3 days left. Ethan told Helga the truth. A substance that might kill the infection. 3 drops every 4 hours. If it made things worse, he would stop. Helga looked at her son, then back at Ethan. Every doctor, every priest, had told her only to pray. This apprentice was the first person to say he would actually try, and she trusted that more than every prayer combined. Ethan dipped a splinter of wood into the liquid and counted 3 drops onto Timo's tongue. The boy grimaced but swallowed. The first night was the hardest. Ethan slept on the floor, waking every 4 hours to give more drops, changing the bandage, checking the fever between doses. By morning, the pus had lightened from green to yellow. The redness hadn't spread further. Too early to hope, far too early. On the second day, Timo asked for water, his voice weak but real. The first conscious sound in today's. The swelling had begun to ease. The wound edges were turning pink. Ethan raised the dose to 4 drops and kept working, brewing a fresh batch of extract, boiling water, cleaning instruments. Helga helped without being asked, carrying water before he even reached for it, handing over clean cloth before he even looked for it. On the third day, Timo asked for food and ate half a bowl of porridge before falling into real, peaceful sleep. Not fever, not stupor, a child's ordinary sleep. Helga sat on the floor and covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking, silent. Ethan stepped outside and breathed the gray morning air, his own hands trembling. Not from exhaustion this time, but from what he'd just done. He had saved a child's life with bread mold and moonshine, in a world that believed the only power that mattered was a number tattooed on skin. By the 4th day, Timo was healing, the scab pink and clean, the fever gone. The red streaks vanished. On the 5th day, the boy stood on his own legs and took 3 wobbling steps before he laughed out loud. Ethan watched from the doorway, and something rose in his throat, because in his old life, children simply didn't die from cuts. Here, the doctor had told them to pray, and a mother had carried her son through dark streets hoping someone, anyone, would try. On the 6th morning, Helga walked into the shop, closed the door behind her, and placed a copper wedding bracelet on the table. The only thing left of her dead husband. She said Ethan could take everything she owned, because her son was alive and laughing in the street. Ethan pushed the bracelet back toward her. He didn't want gold. He wanted a clean room, 6 copper basins, and someone who could read. Helga blinked. These were not the words she'd expected. Ethan told her he was going to heal people, lots of people, and that meant he needed real conditions to do it properly. Helga slid the bracelet back onto her own wrist and said he would have his room, his basins, and a reader too. Her neighbor's daughter, a red-headed girl always buried in books, could help. Ethan sat alone that night, hands on the table, staring at the mark on his palm. 12, still 12. The weakest of the weak. And yet, that same morning, a 5-year-old boy was chasing chickens in a yard because the man marked 12 knew what penicillin was. The next day, a girl arrived, red hair, freckles, wide green eyes, looking at Ethan like he was something out of a legend. Her name was Lyra Venz, daughter of the town's herbalist. 13 years working beside her own father, able to read, write, and remember anything. Ethan asked how old she was. 18, she answered. He asked if she could memorize numbers on the first try. She said she could. He told her to sit down. From this day forward, she would write down everything he did. Every word, every number, every action. Lyra pulled a crumpled sheet of paper and a stub of charcoal from her bosom and said she was ready. Ethan began to dictate the antiseptic formula, step by step, concentration, timing, the exact order of every ingredient. Lyra's handwriting was small and neat, and she never missed a single word. When Ethan used a term she didn't know, she simply paused, waited for the explanation, and kept writing. An hour later, the first recipe was recorded in full. Ethan told her she'd surpass him within 5 years. Lyra blushed to the roots of her red hair. For the first week, Ethan worked 18 hours a day, sleeping on the floor, eating whatever Helga brought him. Helga found him a real clean room, a former coal annex to doors down, stone walls, stone floor, one small window. Ethan washed it with hot water and vinegar, then moonshine, then hot water again. Not sterile, not even close, but cleaner than anything else in this entire city. Helga secured 6 copper basins from a blacksmith, and Ethan assigned each one its own purpose: extraction, filtration, evaporation, clean water, instrument washing, one spare. Lyra arrived at dawn and left after dark, recording every observation, temperature, color, smell, quantity. Ethan called it a protocol, and without a protocol, no result could ever be repeated. The first product came together and for days. Ethan named it simply Pure Solution. Twice distilled moonshine from a crude still built out of a copper teapot, a clay pipe, and a basin of cold water. Ugly, leaking in 3 places, but it worked, killing bacteria on contact with skin. The second product took longer, a crude white powder pressed from white bark and hot vinegar. Not pure aspirin, a rough mixture of salicylates, but it dulled pain. And Ethan tested it on himself first. Then the first real patient arrived, not by rumor, but by Helga's own recommendation. Goran the carpenter, a big bearded man, his cheek swollen to the size of a fist from an infected tooth. Ethan rinsed the abscess with clean solution, dosed him with the white powder, then lanced the swelling with a heated splinter. Goran screamed loud enough to knock pots off the shelf. The next day, his swelling had dropped by half. He looked at Ethan like a man who just watched water turn into wine. He asked what he owed. Ethan asked only for wooden shelves in return. Word spread through Goran's wife, then her neighbor, then the entire market. A week later, 7 people stood waiting outside the shop. Burns, coughs, fevers, ulcers, colic, abscesses. Ethan worked from morning until night. Lyra prepared solutions and recorded every dose. Helga carried water and boiled instruments. On the shop wall, charcoal numbers tracked the week: 17 treated, 11 improving, 4 unchanged, and 1 who died. An old man, over 70, his lungs already ruined by the time he reached the shop. Ethan needed more raw materials, more time, more hands. In the 3rd week, a different kind of visitor walked in without knocking. The town elder, chain around his neck, seal 44, wrinkled his nose at the smell of the shop. He said people were calling Ethan a miracle worker, and the mayor didn't believe in miracles. But the mayor's own son, 12 years old, had a badly broken arm set crooked, screaming in pain every single night. Ethan asked to examine the boy. The fracture had healed at an angle, the bone pressing on a nerve. Constant pain built into every movement. Ethan told the elder the truth. The bone needed resetting, and it would hurt. But he could dull the pain first. He mixed a triple dose of white bark extract with valerian and honey and gave it to the boy to drink. 40 minutes later, the boy lay drowsy and relaxed, the pain finally gone from his eyes. Ethan called on Goran to hold the boy steady, found a flat plank and leather straps, and gripped the forearm. 1 sharp pull, a crack. The boy flinched but didn't cry out. The bone settled into a straighter line, not perfect, but far better than before. Ethan splinted the arm, wrapped it clean, and gave a night dose for the pain. The elder stood silent for a long minute, then asked what Ethan wanted in return. Official ownership of the shop, permission to gather herbs outside town, and no more interference. The elder smirked and asked, interference with what? Ethan said he intended to heal the entire city, and for that he needed time and peace. The elder shook his head, muttering that a boy marked 12 talked like a man of 80, and signed the paperwork anyway, because his son was finally sleeping without crying. By the end of the 1st month, Ethan's shop was the busiest place in Lindholm, second only to the tavern. 41 people healed, for he couldn't save, and he carried every one of those names in his head. Lyra now worked mostly on her own, mixing solutions, dosing children and elders correctly, asking questions every single evening. Why does boiling kill germs? Why does alcohol clean wounds? Why does mold help while dirt only hurts? Helga ran the household and kept the supplies. And in the evenings, Ethan taught her to read by candlelight. One night, Ethan lay awake running through a mental list that never seemed to shrink. Stabilize antibiotic production. Find a pure mold strain. Build a real distiller. Train Lyra further. Find more allies. Build defenses. Because sooner or later someone far more powerful than a town mayor would come looking. And that someone wouldn't want a toothache fixed. He would want Ethan entirely, recipes and all. Ethan had worked in a pharmaceutical plant. He understood exactly how power worked around valuable formulas. In a world without antibiotics, one man holding a penicillin recipe was worth more than any gold mine. He fell asleep to that thought, and in the 6th week, the knock he'd been dreading finally came. A thin man in a black doublet with a silver brooch walked into the shop and waited without a word. He announced that Baron Henrik Waller wished to see this unusual healer, and invited Ethan to dine at the castle that Thursday. Ethan asked what exactly the Baron wanted to see. Everything, the messenger said, especially the white powder the whole town was talking about. Lyra warned him this was dangerous, that her own father had once sold the Baron a rare root and spent 3 years paying for it. Ethan wasn't surprised. A monopoly on medicine in a land at war was tempting a prize for any noble to ignore. Thursday came fast. Ethan packed 3 bottles of solution and a bag of white powder and walked up the hill to the castle. Baron Walder turned out short, stocky, red-bearded, Seal 63, laughing loudly the moment Ethan walked in. Dinner dragged on for an hour while officers discussed the war, an imperial army advancing. A town burned 3 days south. 1 soldier and 3 died from infection after battle. 1 in 5 from fever. If every field hospital had antiseptic and even a crude antibiotic, that death toll could fall by half, maybe more. After dinner, the Baron sent everyone else away and made his offer plain. Hand over every formula. Production would move to the castle, under the Baron's name. Under his protection, Ethan gets gold and a room. Everyone else is satisfied. Ethan said no. He explained that these formulas demanded strict process and training, that the wrong dose turned medicine straight into poison. The Baron's face didn't change. He said he understood, and gave Ethan 1 week to reconsider. Ethan returned after midnight to find Lyra waiting, still writing formulas into a leather notebook by candlelight. A week passed with no messenger. Instead, one night, a dead rat with a rope around its neck appeared at the shop door. The message was clear enough without words. Ethan spent those days finishing a new product, a greenish antiseptic ointment made from copper sulfate, wax, and mutton fat, for failed batches before the 5th held together properly on skin without irritation. He labeled it silver ointment, a name easier to sell than the actual chemistry behind it. Then, one morning, soldiers filled the square, 6 of them, chain mail, a scroll bearing the Baron's seal. The shop was declared closed. The healer, arrested for illegal practice. All potions, confiscated as hazardous. Every point on that scroll was technically true. No license, no guild approval, and tested substances. Ethan stepped outside anyway, because the only weapon he had left was what he'd already done for the city. And then Helga stood in the doorway first, arms crossed, refusing to move. Goran stood beside her. Then his wife. Then the fisherwoman whose cough Ethan had cured. Then more. Then more. Within 5 minutes, 30 townspeople blocked that door. Every single one of them a patient Ethan had once helped. The soldiers hesitated. The Baron had never given an order to strike down his own citizens. The town elder stepped forward and warned that an arrest here would only cause unrest. The soldier rolled up his scroll, said he would return, and led his men away. The crowd stood silent until they vanished around the corner, and then everyone spoke at once. Ethan understood exactly what he'd bought: a day, maybe 2. Not victory, never victory. The Baron didn't lose to apprentices. Next time, it wouldn't be 6 soldiers with a scroll. It would be 20 with swords. That evening, watching Lyra sew a new notebook and Helga wash dishes with Timo asleep in the corner, Ethan made a decision. Leave Lindholm, carry the knowledge somewhere safer. Find a patron with real power behind him. He remembered the officers at dinner, talking about a countess whose daughter lay dying. A woman who would pay any price for a cure. Her city, Velmer, sat for days south. Lyra asked if he was afraid. Ethan admitted he was. That a man marked 12 could be snapped in half by any drunk soldier on any street. But standing still was even more dangerous, because the Baron was coming back, and 30 townspeople with pitchforks wouldn't help twice. They left at dawn. Ethan, Helga carrying Timo, Lyra with 2 heavy bags, Goran hauling a box of tools on his back. In Ethan's own bag rode everything he'd built: 12 sheets of parchment, 3 bottles of solution, powder, ointment, and 2 jars of live mold culture. The entire capital of his new world's future, wrapped in rags and hay so it wouldn't break. The road wound past burned villages and refugee carts, and once, a cart creaked by carrying a man with a blood-soaked bandage on his head. Ethan stopped. Helga touched his shoulder and shook her head. Not now, not here. Walking past that man was one of the hardest choices of his entire 6 weeks in this world. Cold math. 1 wounded stranger on the road, against hundreds who might live if he reached Velmer in time. Math he hated with everything in him, and obeyed anyway. By noon on the 2nd day, Ethan's borrowed body simply gave out, legs failing, vision darkening on a roadside rock. Goran hoisted him onto his back without asking permission, saying a man marked 28 could carry a kid marked 12 the whole way if he had to. By evening, they reached a small village and found a room at a tavern that smelled of sour beer and wet wool. Inside sat a woman alone, dark hair, military jacket, a scar over her left eyebrow, a dirty bandage visible on her wrist. Ethan walked over and told her he was a healer, and that he could see her wound. She looked at the mark on his palm and smiled without much warmth. A healer marked 12. a new concept in medicine. Ethan said the mark measured his hands, not his mind. And his mind worked better than most people's hands ever would. Something in his voice made her pause, and she unwound the bandage. A torn wound on her forearm, red and swelling, the first signs of infection creeping in. Ethan cleaned it with sterile solution, applied silver ointment, and bandaged it properly in under 10 minutes. She introduced herself as Sora Kim, a military medic, her unit ambushed weeks ago. 9 survivors out of 30. She'd earned this wound dragging her commander 3 miles to safety. He died anyway. All she'd had was a dirty rag and a prayer. Ethan told her he was heading to Velmer, and that his team had no one who understood field medicine the way she did. Sora studied the bottles on the table, the solution, the powder, the ointment, and asked what exactly he could offer an army. She'd watched healthy men rot from a scratch in a week because no one knew what to do with the pus. If this kid Mark 12 wasn't lying, she wanted to see it for herself. By morning, there were 6 of them on the road. Sora with a sword at her belt and a fresh bandage on her arm. On the second evening, sitting by the fire, Sora finally spoke without being asked. Her wound didn't hurt anymore, the first pain-free night into weeks. She told Ethan about her younger brother, 18. An arrow wound in the thigh that should never have killed him. No treatment but a rag and water. He died within a week, his leg turned black by then. Ethan said nothing. He didn't try to comfort her. He just sat beside her in the dark. A minute later, Sora said she wanted to learn everything he knew, so she'd never stand helpless on a battlefield again. Ethan told her they'd start tomorrow. On the 4th day, they reached Velmer, 3 times the size of Lindholm, refugees streaming toward its gates like a long ribbon. Ethan stood on the hill and looked down at everything ahead of him. A countess, a dying daughter, a chance that could change everything, or kill him. At the gate, a guard sneered at Ethan's mark, but Sora flashed her military badge, and they were let through. Inside, Velmer was another world entirely. Paved streets, guild quarters, a countess's estate crowning the hill in white stone. Ethan sent word through Sora's old contact in the garrison, a simple message. There was a man in town who could heal festering wounds in 5 days. The countess agreed to receive him the next morning. Ethan barely slept, staring at his own weak hands, knowing everything would be decided by sunrise. Countess Velmer's estate smelled of wax and sickness, the same heavy scent that clung to any room where someone had been dying too long. She was tall, dark-haired, streaked with silver, straight-backed, seal 51. Her eyes red from too many sleepless nights. Beside her stood the estate physician, seal 48, who twisted his lips the moment he saw Ethan's mark. The countess said she would listen, but if Ethan was a fraud, he would leave the city before sunset. Upstairs, her daughter lay under 3 blankets, 14 years old, pale to the point of transparency, breathing fast and shallow. Ethan examined her throat, red and swollen, white spots on the tonsils, a fine rash across her stomach, rough to the touch. He knew this illness instantly. In his old world, 10 days of antibiotics cured it completely. Scarlet fever, left untreated for 3 weeks already, risking permanent damage to heart and kidneys. The physician had been bloodletting a dehydrated, feverish child twice already. Ethan bit back everything he wanted to say about that. Not the time, not the place. He told the countess he needed 5 days, a clean room, boiled water, and the physician kept far away from his own patient. The countess asked why she should believe a boy marked 12 over a certified guild master. Ethan had Sora unwrap her own forearm, healed clean and pink after just 4 days of the same treatment. The countess stared at the wound, then at Ethan, and said one single word: begin. Ethan rinsed the girl's throat with warm salt water, fed her diluted bark extract for the fever, and measured out 6 careful drops of golden mold extract. The girl grimaced and swallowed. The doctor paced the hallway, loudly predicting a quack would kill the child. Ethan ignored him completely. Every 4 hours, another dose, every fever spike, another bark decoction, every soaked sheet. Changed without complaint. On the 2nd morning, the fever broke. On the 3rd day, the girl opened her eyes and asked, weakly, for food. On the 4th day, she sat up in bed, her rash fading, her lymph nodes shrinking, her temperature finally steady. On the 5th day, she stood, and the countess wrapped her only remaining child in both arms and simply held her. That evening, the countess called Ethan into her study, all the coldness gone from her face. She told him 3 doctors, including the capital's own master physician, had already given up her daughter for dead. A boy marked 12 had done in 5 days what the entire guild of physicians had failed to accomplish at all. Ethan asked for an estate with room to build a real workshop, funding for materials, permission to train apprentices, and protection from Baron Walder. Most of all, he asked for time, a full year, undisturbed. In exchange, He promised 3 things within that year: a cure for festering wounds, a painkiller without unconsciousness, an ointment that healed 3 times faster, enough of each to supply an entire army. The Countess studied the war map on her wall, the burned cities marked in black crosses, and said a year was too long. 6 months. War wouldn't wait. Ethan agreed. It wasn't much time. It was more than he dared to hope for. At the door, the Countess warned him quietly that betrayal would bring consequences worse than death. Ethan told her he wouldn't betray her, and meant it. The estate near the southern gate became a fortress of purpose, a laboratory, a warehouse, living quarters, a stable. Helga ran the household, Lyra ran the lab, Sora ran security and field medicine. Goran built and repaired everything that needed it. With real funding, Goran built a proper distiller from soldered copper, producing consistent 75% alcohol batch after reliable batch. Pure solutions scaled from 10 bottles a day to 20, then 50. Each one logged by Lyra down to the last detail. The white powder grew pure through real extraction and recrystallization, its final name simplified for anyone to remember. Silver ointment improved too. Once real silver nitrate replaced the cruder copper compound. Stronger, longer lasting, gentler on the skin. In the 6th week, 12 hopeful apprentices showed up, and Ethan tested every one of them with scent, memory, and focus. He kept only 8. Quality mattered more than numbers, always. Because one careless hand in the lab was more dangerous than an empty seat. Training ran in 3 levels. Hygiene first, basic technique second, deep understanding. Reserved only for Lyra and Sora last. Lyra learned by asking why. Sora learned by asking when. Thinking always in terms of speed and battlefield results. Ethan drilled her through protocol after protocol until she could recite treatments for every wound. With her eyes closed, she worked herself past exhaustion more than once. And Ethan found her asleep at the table more than once too. By the 2nd month, the lab ran like a small factory. 50 bottles of antiseptic a day, 20 painkiller sachets, 30 jars of ointment. Behind closed doors, at night, Ethan worked alone on something he hadn't shown anyone yet. A real, stable antibiotic. Weeks of testing different broths, different temperatures, different filtering methods, with Lyra logging every single result. After 6 weeks, they found it. Rye broth. Room temperature. 10 days growth. Filtered through cloth, then crushed charcoal. Ethan called it golden drops, and tested every batch on raw meat, treated against untreated, watching which one rotted first. By the end of the 3rd month, for stable products stood in rows across the lab, and hundreds of lives had already changed because of them. Then, in the 4th month, an enemy arrived that no formula could cure. A sealed scroll bore the crest of the capital's Guild of Physicians, demanding the workshop close immediately. Signed by Archmaster Roderick Tom, Seal 6-7, the man who for 30 years had decided who was allowed to practice medicine at all. A week later, 3 guild inspectors arrived in person, sniffing at bottles, scribbling notes, smiling oily little smiles. No license, no documents, no guild-approved training. The recommendation was simple. Close the workshop until proper licensing was complete. Licensing that took to 2 for years, cost more than a merchant's annual income, and required to master's recommendations from the very guild trying to shut him down. A closed system, built to keep every newcomer out in any world. 2 days later, a formal order banned the sale of all unverified medical compounds across the entire Confederation. Ethan couldn't fight the guild head-on. No political power, no money for bribes, no army of his own. So he walked instead to the Velmer Hospital, 90 of its beds full of wounded soldiers dying not from wounds, but from dirty rags and bloodletting. He estimated 30 of them would die within the month, purely from neglect and infection. That night, he brought Sora to General Boyd Hahart, a veteran commander who needed living soldiers, not guild paperwork. Ethan laid out for items on the general's desk and made one simple promise. With these, the hospital's death rate would fall by more than half. The general demanded proof. Ethan proposed a trial. 10 of the hospital's most hopeless cases, treated his way against 10 equally severe cases under standard guild care. 2 weeks, if more of his patients died than the guild's, Ethan would leave Velmer forever. He agreed instantly. The 10 patients were brutal, festering limbs, infected burns, an open hip fracture, a stab wound already sliding into peritonitis. Ethan and Sora worked side by side, cleaning, dosing, bandaging, examining every 2 hours, while the guild healers next door kept bleeding their own patients dry. By the end of the 1st week, one of Ethan's 10 had died. The infection to advance before treatment even began. The remaining 9 were stabilizing, fevers breaking, burns healing. Meanwhile, 3 of the guild's 10 had already died that same week. By the end of the second week, 8 of Ethan's 10 patients had survived. Of the guild's 10, only 4 remained alive. General Hahart walked the wards himself, counted the living and the empty beds, and told Ethan the guild could shove its licenses wherever it liked. From that day forward, the hospital adopted Ethan's methods, and the general promised a personal recommendation straight to the king. Sora looked at the 8 survivors, men who 2 weeks earlier had been given up for dead, and turned away so Ethan wouldn't see her shoulders shake. Then she turned back, steady again, and said she was ready to teach the other hospital medics everything she learned. At the end of the 5th month, an enemy far quieter than the guild came for Ethan in the middle of the night. A floorboard creaked on the stairs. Ethan woke before his mind even understood why. He had no weapon worth the name, only a bottle of concentrated alcohol left on his table from an experiment. The door swung open. A hooded figure slipped through, a blade glinting in one hand. Ethan hurled the bottle at the floor instead of the man. Glass shattered. Alcohol splashed across the killer's feet, stinging the air. The assassin recoiled just as Lyra's scream tore through the walls behind them. The killer lunged, blade aimed at Ethan's throat. He threw himself backward onto the bed, the edge slicing past close enough to feel the wind of it. Then Sora filled the doorway, silent, and struck once with the hilt of her sword. The assassin dropped, unconscious. A knife stuck quivering in the floor a finger width from Ethan's foot. Sora pulled off the hood and ripped a bronze medallion from around the man's neck. A fist, clutching a lightning bolt. The symbol of the Order of Pure Power, a faith that preached true strength lived only in the body, and any other kind of influence was heresy. Ethan stood barefoot on alcohol-soaked floorboards and understood. Not the Baron, not the guild. Something older. Something rooted in every temple and every barracks across the Confederation. By morning, Sora had learned what she could from the captured assassin. A mercenary hired through a middleman, a bounty equal to Ethan's own weight in gold. Ethan told the Countess everything. She named the Order's leader in the Confederation, Archbishop Sylvan Carr, charming, dangerous, with people everywhere. The Order wanted one thing: for the world to stay exactly as it had been for 1,000 years. Power measured only by the number on a person's skin. Ethan gathered everyone at the estate and told them plainly that staying by his side now meant real danger. No one left. Goran said his fixed tooth was worth standing against any knife. Lyra asked who else would keep the logbook. Helga simply tucked a kitchen knife into her belt and went to cook lunch without a word. From that day, the estate became a small fortress, guards at every gate, patrols through the night. Formulas kept in duplicate. Ethan pushed forward anyway, refining Golden Drop's production, with Lyra suggesting they average extracts across parallel mold batches, a technique he hadn't even taught her. He told her that in 5 years, she'd surpass him completely. She blushed, but this time out of pride, not embarrassment. The 6th month arrived, the Countess's deadline, and Ethan prepared his demonstration in the stone courtyard instead of a boardroom. The Countess arrived with General Hahart to colonels, a quartermaster, and one guest Ethan hadn't expected: Archbishop Sylvan Carr himself, the very man who had paid to have him killed a month earlier. Smiling warmly and shaking Ethan's hand as if nothing had happened at all, Ethan opened with the antiseptic, cutting his own forearm with a knife in front of everyone, then washing it clean and bandaging it on the spot. He ran a dirty knife across raw meat beside a piece clean with his solution, promising the difference would be undeniable within 2 days. Next came the painkiller, dosed into a healthy soldier who then let his own arm be pinched hard without so much as flinching. Then the ointment, shown side by side. One burn treated the old way, festering and hot. One burn treated Ethan's way, closing clean and pink. Finally, Golden Drops, credited with saving 30 soldiers the hospital had already given up as lost. Ethan offered full-scale supply for the entire southern front, 1,000 bottles of antiseptic a month, hundreds of doses of the rest. If given the resources to build 10 times bigger, General Hahart stood and declared he'd seen enough. That his letter to the king wouldn't be a request anymore, but a demand. The Countess pledged full funding for the expansion. The colonels promised the first wounded immediately. Archbishop Carr approached last, placed a warm hand on Ethan's shoulder, and promised the Order's own blessing on his school. Ethan looked into those gentle gray eyes and saw calculation hiding behind every kind word. He smiled back anyway. 2 men standing face to face, each one certain the other wanted him dead. That evening, Ethan sat alone on the porch steps as the sun dropped behind the city walls, an empty table of empty boxes behind him. One by one, Sora, Lyra, and Helga came out and sat beside him without a word. Helga pressing a mug of warm milk into his hands. 6 months ago, he'd woken up in a dying stranger's body with nothing. Now he had a workshop, apprentices, medicines that saved lives, people who stood beside him, and an enemy who smiled directly in his face. 3 weeks after that demonstration, a royal courier arrived bearing a golden seal and an invitation from King Alaric Mioris himself. The countess called it both good news and bad news, because the capital belonged to the guild, the order, and a dozen other players who wanted Ethan controlled or destroyed. Sora would travel with him. That was never up for discussion. Lyra would stay behind to run the workshop, and Helga and Goran with her. The journey to the capital city of Orenhol took 6 days on horseback, a body still unused to the saddle aching the entire way. Sora rode tense beside him the whole time, one hand always near her sword. Sleepless the first night at every campsite. Orenhol rose on the 7th morning, stone walls 6 men high, golden spires catching the sunlight above a river cutting through the city. They were given rooms in the palace's guest wing, and Sora immediately checked every wall for hidden doors. The audience was set for the following morning. Ethan packed his bag with for products, hospital records, and every number that told the true story of what these medicines had done. The throne room stretched enormous, dark stone columns, tapestries of old battles, courtiers lining every wall. Archbishop Sylvan Carr stood beside the throne, still smiling, as if the assassin in the night had never happened at all. King Alaric Mioris looked younger than Ethan expected, sharp-eyed, muscular, Seal 74, studying Ethan the way a craftsman studies a new tool. He didn't smile, he simply spoke, saying that General Hahart had written him the full pages, when the general rarely wrote more than 3 lines. A man who could make a battle-hardened general write like that, the king said, deserved his full attention. Ethan stood there, marked 12, in a room built for men marked 50 and higher, and understood exactly what this moment was. Not a reward. Not yet, just the door finally opening, 6 months of blood, mold, and stubborn work standing behind him instead of ahead. Every eye in that hall, the kings, the archbishops, the colonels lining the walls, was fixed on a boy who by every rule of this world should have meant nothing at all. And yet here he stood, because a dying old man had once taken in an orphan with a worthless number, and a stranger from another life had refused to let that number decide anything. The king leaned forward slightly on his throne, the first real crack in his composed expression. He said that Hahart's letter claimed the Velmer Hospital had lost fewer soldiers in 2 months than in the entire previous year combined. He asked, plainly, if that number was true. Ethan answered without hesitation. It was true, and he had the hospital's own records in his bag to prove every word of it. The archbishop's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still. The king asked how a boy marked 12 could accomplish what guild masters marked 50 have failed to do for decades. Ethan said the mark measured strength of body, nothing more, and that the war outside these walls was being lost as much to infection as to swords. He said knowledge didn't care what number was tattooed on the hand that carried it. A murmur passed through the courtiers along the walls, quiet, uncertain, the sound of an old rule cracking just slightly. The king studied Ethan for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward Archbishop Carr, waiting to see what the order's man would say. Carr spoke smoothly, offering the order's continued blessing, calling Ethan a gift to the wounded of the whole confederation. Every word slid out warm and generous, and every word was a lie. And both men in that room knew it perfectly well. The king said little more, only that he intended to see these medicines proven again, here, in the capital, under his own eyes. Ethan bowed, the same shallow bow he'd given at the start, unwilling to pretend at customs he'd never learned. As the audience closed, Sora exhaled slowly beside him, the tension in her shoulders easing by the smallest fraction. Outside the throne room, the corridor stretched long and cold, courtiers whispering behind raised hands as Ethan passed. He walked past every one of them without slowing, because 6 months ago he couldn't have imagined a hallway like this, even noticing he existed. Sora asked quietly if he thought the king believed him. Ethan said belief didn't matter yet. Only results mattered, and results were the one thing he'd never once failed to deliver. That night in the guest wing, Ethan sat by the window and looked out over a city larger than anything he'd known even in his old life. Somewhere out there, wounded soldiers were dying from infections that a jar of golden drops could have stopped cold. Somewhere out there, the Order of Pure Power was already deciding what to do about a man who refused to stay in his place. Ethan thought about Barnaby, wheezing on a straw mattress on the very first night of this entire journey. He thought about Timo chasing chickens in a yard, about Amelia laughing in her mother's arms, about 8 soldiers who should have been dead and weren't. None of that had happened because of a number on his skin. All of it had happened because he refused to let that number be the whole story. The next morning, a royal steward arrived with new instructions. The king wished for a full demonstration, held publicly within the week. Word of the boy marked 12 had already begun spreading through the capital, faster than any courier could ride. Nobles who had never once looked twice at a low seal now sent servants, asking quiet questions about the workshop in Velmer. Archbishop Carr sent a gift the same afternoon, fine wine and warm words, wrapped around a threat Ethan could read perfectly clearly. Sora insisted on tasting nothing from that gift before Ethan did, and he didn't argue with her about it. The Guild of Physicians sent their own delegation the following day, Archmaster Tom himself, Seal 6-7, standing stiff and cold at the door. Tom demanded to know by what authority an unlicensed boy dared perform medicine inside the capital itself. Ethan answered simply that authority came from results, and offered to demonstrate those results in front of Tom's own physicians, if the guild dared to watch. Tom's jaw tightened. He left without another word, but his silence carried its own kind of threat. Sora watched him go, and said quietly, that men like that rarely forgave being made to look foolish in public. Ethan spent the days before the royal demonstration preparing everything with the same discipline he'd used back in Lindholm. Clean bottles, careful labels, records translated into numbers even a skeptical king couldn't argue away. He requested access to the capital's own military hospital, wanting real patients, not stage theater, to prove every claim. The king granted it, and Ethan walked those wards the same way he'd once walked the Velmer hospital, choosing the worst cases first. A soldier with a gangrenous hand, a woman with childbed fever, a boy with a burn already turning black at the edges. Sora worked at his side without needing instructions anymore, cleaning wounds, measuring doses, reading Ethan's hands before he even spoke. On the day of the public demonstration, the capital's courtyard filled with nobles, physicians, soldiers, and curious citizens packed shoulder to shoulder. Ethan stood at the center with his products laid out on a plain wooden table, exactly as he had in Velmer 6 months earlier. The king watched from a raised platform. Archbishop Carr stood near him, still smiling. Archmaster Tom stood rigid at the edge of the crowd. Ethan walked the crowd through every result: the antiseptic, the painkiller, the ointment, the golden drops, patient after patient shown as living proof. When he finished, silence held the courtyard for a long moment before the king finally rose from his seat. He said the Confederation had lost more soldiers to infection than to any single battle in the last 3 years combined. He said that ended now, and that Master Ethan Cross would be granted royal protection, land, and resources to build without limit. A murmur of shock swept through the crowd. Archbishop Carr's smile finally, briefly faltered. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment he'd woken up on Barnaby's floor. It wasn't safety. Not completely. The Order still wanted him dead, and the Guild still wanted him gone. But it was something no Seal of 12 had ever earned in this world before. Standing. That night, Sora found him on the palace balcony, staring out at the lit windows of a city that finally knew his name for the right reasons. She said nothing at first, just stood beside him, the way she had every hard night since the tavern where they'd first met. Then she said quietly that her brother would have lived if a man like Ethan had existed on that battlefield. Ethan said he couldn't change the past, only build something so it never happened to anyone else's brother again. Sora nodded once, and for the first time since he'd known her, something in her shoulders looked almost at rest. Word of the royal endorsement reached Velmer within days, carried by a rider Ethan sent ahead himself. Lyra read the letter aloud to Helga and Goran in the courtyard, her voice cracking with something between disbelief and pride. Helga wept without embarrassment, holding Timo close, remembering a boy who once couldn't stand on his own 2 legs. Goran simply nodded, satisfied, and went back to reinforcing the workshop's new foundation. Back in the capital, Archbishop Carr requested a private audience with Ethan, alone, without guards, without witnesses. Sora refused to let him go without her standing outside the door, sword ready. Whatever the Archbishop preferred. Carr received him warmly, as always, offering wine Ethan didn't touch, smiling the same gentle smile that hid a killer's patience. He said the Order had reconsidered its position, that perhaps there was room in this new world for both old strength and new knowledge. Ethan said he didn't believe a word of that, and Carr's smile widened, as if he respected the honesty more than any polite lie could earn. Carr admitted, quietly, that the Order couldn't move against a man the king himself now protected. Not directly. Not yet. He warned that patience was the Order's oldest weapon, and that 1,000 years of waiting had never once run out. Ethan said he intended to spend every one of those years making sure the Order never got the chance to use it. Carr laughed softly at that, genuinely amused, and told him to enjoy the king's favor while it lasted. Ethan left that room understanding the war hadn't ended. It had only changed shape, moving from knives in the dark to something slower and colder. Sora asked what was said. Ethan told her everything. because secrets between them had already cost enough close calls. She said as long as she was breathing, no order, no archbishop, no assassin would get near him again. Ethan believed her completely. Within a month, construction began on a new royal workshop, 10 times the size of Velmer's, funded directly from the crown's own treasury. Ethan sent for Lyra to help design its training program, and for the first time she stepped into the capital herself, notebook in hand. She stood in the same throne room Ethan had once entered as a stranger, and this time courtiers actually turned to watch her pass. Apprentices came from every corner of the Confederation now, no longer 8 at a time, but dozens, then hundreds, waiting for a chance to learn. Ethan kept the same standard he'd set on day 1 in Lindholm. Careless hands were more dangerous than empty seats, no matter how badly he needed workers. Production of Golden Drop scaled beyond anything he'd imagined possible 6 months earlier. Entire crates shipped to field hospitals along the southern front. Reports came back from the war zone itself. Soldiers surviving wounds that would have killed them a year earlier without a second thought. 1 in 3 no longer meant 1 in 3 dead. The numbers General Hehart had once quoted at dinner had finally started to bend. The Guild of Physicians never formally apologized, but their inspections quietly stopped. One by one, without explanation. Archmaster Tom retired from public view within the year, his authority hollowed out by a boy he'd once dismissed on sight. Baron Walder, back in Lindholm, sent no more soldiers, no more dead rats at the door. A man under royal protection was no longer worth the risk. Ethan still thought of him sometimes, the first enemy, small compared to everything that came after, but the first proof that this world would fight back. Helga eventually moved the household to the capital as well. Timo, now old enough to run errands through workshop halls instead of chasing chickens. He liked to tell anyone who listened that Ethan had saved his life with moldy bread, a story that never failed to earn him free sweets from the kitchen staff. Lyra split her time between the capital and Velmer, training new instructors, writing the first real medical textbook this world had ever seen. She dedicated it quietly, without asking permission, to a herbalist named Barnaby, who never got to see any of it happen. Sora became head of military medicine for the entire Southern Army, training field medics and protocols that once existed only in her own memorized drills. She kept Ethan's original silver ointment recipe sewn into the lining of her jacket, in case she ever needed to rebuild everything from nothing again. Ethan himself rarely slept more than a few hours most nights, still driven by the same restless list that had kept him awake in Lindholm. Stabilize this, improve that, train someone new. Find the next disease this world had no answer for yet. But somewhere, along the road from a dying man's floor to a king's own courtyard, the fear that once kept him awake had changed shape too. It wasn't fear of being weak anymore. It was the responsibility of being needed by too many people to ever stop moving. One evening, standing on the balcony of his new workshop, Ethan looked out over rooftops lit gold in the sunset. Somewhere below, apprentices were grinding bark, filtering mold cultures, labeling bottles that would travel to soldiers who'd never know his name. He thought about the number still resting quietly on his palm, 12. Unchanged since the day he woke up in this world. It had never once measured what actually mattered. Not the strength to lift a sword, or the speed to outrun a soldier, or the muscle to survive this world on brute force alone. It had never accounted for 6 years at a pharmaceutical plant in Boston. 6 years nobody in this world could see or tattoo onto skin. And it had certainly never accounted for the people who chose to stand beside a man the world had already written off. Helga, who trusted a stranger with her only child before she trusted a single prayer. Lyra, who saw a place for herself the very first day someone told her to write it down. Sora, who walked away from a battlefield full of the dead to bet everything on a boy marked 12. Goran, who carried him on his own back rather than let exhaustion win. None of them had followed a number. They had followed what that number could never contain. A man who looked at bread mold and moonshine and saw a way to save a child's life, when the entire world had already given up. The war in the South hadn't ended. The order of pure power hadn't disappeared. The guild hadn't forgiven him. But none of that changed what had already happened, quietly, one patient at a time. From a dying herbalist shop to a king's own throne room. A boy who arrived with nothing but knowledge no one here understood. Had built something this world had never seen in 1,000 years. Not power measured in seals and numbers, but power measured in lives that kept breathing because someone refused to accept rock bottom. As the end of the story, Ethan turned from the balcony and walked back inside, toward the sound of Lyra dictating notes, toward the smell of alcohol and herbs and hard-won progress. Tomorrow there would be new patients, new formulas to refine, new threats waiting somewhere in the shadows of a world that still measured worth by a tattoo. But tonight, for just a little while, the workshop was quiet and the people inside it were safe. And that was enough. Somewhere far south, a soldier who should have died from a scratch was writing a letter home instead. Somewhere in Lindholm, a boy named Timo who once nearly died was growing up healthy, loud, and completely unaware how close he'd come to not existing at all. And somewhere in a royal workshop that hadn't existed a year earlier, the man marked 12 kept working, because the story was never really about the number. It was about everything he built despite it, one impossible night at a time. Months later, Ethan stood once more in Barnaby's old shop in Lindholm, now preserved as it had been. Walls scrubbed clean, shelves still lined with clay pots. He'd asked the crown to leave it standing exactly as it was, untouched. A monument to where all of this had actually begun. He ran a hand along the same shelf where he'd first smelled mint, sage, and white bark on a morning that felt like another lifetime. Barnaby never learned what his shop would grow into. He never learned the boy he'd sheltered would one day stand before a king. But every bottle of golden drops now shipped across the Confederation carried, quietly, a debt Ethan intended to keep paying for the rest of his life. He knelt by the small marker placed outside the shop. Simple stone, simple words. The name of a herbalist who'd given shelter to a stranger with nothing. Ethan said, out loud, that everything built since that night had started with one dying man choosing kindness over convenience. He said the debt was still being paid. And every patient who walked out of a hospital alive instead of in a coffin. He stood, and the wind moved through the empty street the same way it had on the morning he first opened these shutters. Back at the estate that evening, Helga had prepared a meal large enough for everyone who'd walked this road together. From the very start, Timo, taller now, argued loudly with Goran about who'd caught the biggest fish that afternoon, and nobody bothered to correct either of them. Lyra sat across from Ethan, her leather notebook now one of dozens filling a shelf behind her, each one a record of exactly how far they'd come. Sora leaned against the doorway, sword within reach out of habit more than necessity now, watching the table with something close to peace on her face. Ethan looked around at every one of them, and thought about the numbers still resting quietly on his own palm. 12. It had never changed. It would probably never change. And for the first time since waking up in a stranger's body, that fact didn't feel like a sentence anymore. It felt almost like proof. Proof that everything sitting at this table had been built by choice, by work, by people who decided to trust a number that told them nothing at all. Word arrived that week that the Order of Pure Power had quietly withdrawn its bounty, unwilling to risk open war with the king's own protected physician. It wasn't peace. Archbishop Carr's patience hadn't run out, only shifted into something slower, watching from a farther distance now. But for tonight, at this table, that distance was enough room to breathe. The Guild of Physicians, stripped of its old monopoly, had grudgingly begun sending students to Ethan's own workshop instead of the other way around. Some came bitter, resentful of a system appended by an outsider marked 12. Most left. Weeks later, believers in results over tradition. Ethan never gloated about that shift. He simply kept teaching. Because converting an enemy quietly mattered more than beating one loudly. The war in the South had begun, finally, to turn. Field hospitals stocked with antiseptic, and golden drops were losing far fewer soldiers than before. General Hahart wrote once more, this time not begging for supplies, but reporting numbers that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Survival rates from battlefield wounds had climbed past anything this Confederation had recorded in living memory. Ethan read that letter twice, quietly, and folded it away without saying much, because the number mattered more to him than the credit ever would. Somewhere in that number were soldiers like Sora's brother, boys who might have died from an arrow wound, now walking home instead. He couldn't undo what had already happened before he arrived, but he could make certain fewer families ever had to feel what Sora had felt. The Countess of Velmer sent a letter that same season, her daughter Amelia now fully grown into health, studying under Lyra herself at the workshop. Amelia wanted to become a healer in her own right, the Countess wrote, and asked only that Ethan allow her the same chance he'd once given a herbalist's daughter. Ethan agreed without hesitation, remembering a 14-year-old girl who'd been given up for dead by 3 separate physicians. Some debts, he thought, were best repaid not in gold, but in passing knowledge forward to the next person willing to fight for it. By the following spring, 3 more workshops had opened across the Confederation, each trained directly by apprentices who'd once trained under Ethan himself. Lyra oversaw all of them personally, traveling more than she ever imagined a herbalist's daughter from Lindholm ever would. She kept, always, a copy of that very first recipe she'd written down at Ethan's dictation. Ink faded, corners worn soft from handling. She told her own students that everything they now knew had started with one exhausted man, explaining formulas to a girl with a stub of charcoal. Sora built her own school within the military itself. training field medics directly on the front lines instead of waiting for wounded men. To reach the capital, she never forgot the tavern where a stranger with a worthless number had looked at her infected wound and simply offered to help. Helga, now fluent in reading and writing herself, ran the administration of the entire royal workshop, its supplies, its schedules, its endless correspondence. She still cooked dinner most nights, refusing every offer to hire kitchen staff, because feeding this family had never once felt like a chore to her. Gorham built furniture for every new workshop that opened, insisting personally on inspecting the wood himself before any apprentice touched a tool. He still told anyone who listened that fixing his own tooth all those years ago had been the luckiest moment of his entire life. Timo, now a teenager, spent every free hour in the lab, determined to become an apprentice himself the moment Ethan judged him ready. Ethan watched him grind herbs with careful, steady hands, and thought about a 5-year-old boy who once couldn't lift his own head off a table. The mark on Ethan's own palm remained unchanged through all of it, 12, exactly as it had been the morning he first woke up in this world. He'd stopped hiding it years ago. He wore his sleeve rolled up now, without shame, without apology, without anything to prove to anyone watching. Because the story of Ethan Cross had never been about outgrowing a number. It had always been about proving that number had never been the whole story to begin with. One evening, a new apprentice, young, nervous, marked with a low seal of his own, asked Ethan directly if the number ever stopped mattering. Ethan told him the truth. It never stopped mattering to the world around him, but it had stopped mattering to what he chose to do with his own hands. He told the boy that Barnaby had once given a stranger shelter without asking his seal, and that single choice had rewritten an entire confederation. He told him that Helga had trusted a healer Mark 12 with her only child, when every Mark 50 in town had already turned her away. He told him that Lyra had picked up a pencil the very first day, and never once asked whether a girl's place was in the trade. He told him that Sora had walked away from a battlefield of the dead to bet everything on a stranger, with nothing to his name. The boy listened, quiet, and asked what he should do with his own low seal, his own uncertain place in this world. Ethan said the same thing Barnaby's shop had taught him from the very first wheezing breath he'd heard in this world. Find the thing the number can't measure, and build something with it that the world can't ignore. The boy nodded slowly, the way Lyra once had, the way Sora once had, the way every one of them had, standing at the beginning of something they couldn't yet see. Years later, historians of the Confederation would argue over exactly when the age of seals had truly begun to crack. Some pointed to the royal demonstration in Orenhall, when a king first watched a boy marked 12 outperform physicians marked 50. Others pointed further back to a small hospital trial in Velmer. 10 hopeless patients against 10 more, and 8 who lived who shouldn't have. But the people who actually lived through it knew the truth started earlier still. In a dying herbalist one-room shop, over a pot of moldy bread broth. It started the moment a stranger from another world chose not to let a foreign body's weakness decide what he was capable of. It started with an old man's final act of kindness toward a boy no one else wanted, repaid 1,000 times over in lives no one else could save. The war in the South eventually ended, not with total victory, but with a peace built partly on soldiers who survived to keep fighting for it. The order of pure power never vanished entirely. Old beliefs rarely die all at once, but its grip on this world had loosened, permanently, undeniably. The Guild of Physicians rebuilt itself around new standards, hygiene, evidence, results, rather than pedigree, than inherited titles alone. And across every field hospital, every workshop, every small-town shop that once turned away a boy marked 12, something had fundamentally shifted. Strength still mattered in this world. It always would. But it was no longer the only currency that decided who got to matter at all. Ethan Cross never forgot where it began. He kept Barnaby's original mortar and pestle on his own desk for the rest of his life. Worn stone, chipped at one edge. The very tool he'd used to grind that first crude powder on a morning he thought might be his last. Visitors to the royal workshop often asked why a man surrounded by copper stills and gleaming glass kept something so plain and old on display. Ethan always gave the same answer. Because everything in this room existed only because of what that stone had helped him build first. He taught for decades, training generations of apprentices who never once had to bury a patient the way he'd once buried Barnaby. Lyra eventually wrote the Confederation's first comprehensive medical text, translated into every major language spoken south of the war's old front line. She dedicated its final chapter to every patient who hadn't survived, naming each one, because Ethan had once told her that names mattered more than numbers. Sora rose to command the entire Southern Army's medical corps, training thousands of field medics and protocols that once existed in only one woman's memory. She kept, until the end of her career, the same scar over her eyebrow, a reminder of the tavern where an unlikely partnership had first begun. Helga lived to see her son Timo become a fully licensed healer in his own right, working beside the very man who'd once saved his life with bread mold. Goran's grandchildren grew up hearing the story of a toothache fixed with a heated splinter, embellished a little more with every retelling. And somewhere in every one of those stories, the same quiet truth kept repeating itself. Generation after generation, a number tattooed on skin could measure strength. It could never measure what a person chose to do with the mind behind that skin. Ethan never became the strongest man in the Confederation. His seal never rose past 12 for the rest of his life. But he became something this world had no word for before he arrived. A man whose weakness reshaped an entire understanding of power itself. Not by defeating anyone in battle, not by claiming a throne or a title, by kneeling beside a dying old man on his very first morning in this world, and refusing to accept that nothing could be done, by choosing, again and again, to build rather than despair, to teach rather than hoard, to trust people rather than formulas alone, by understanding that a mark on the skin could never account for 6 years, spent quietly learning chemistry in a life no one here would ever see. The boy who woke up with the number 12 tattooed on his arm had once believed that meant rock bottom, and nothing more. He learned slowly, painfully, one patient at a time, that rock bottom was simply the place where the real work always had to begin. Because from rock bottom, the only direction left was up. And Ethan Cross had spent every single day since that first morning climbing. Not alone, never alone. Beside a widow who trusted him before she had any reason to. Beside a girl who picked up a pencil and never put it down. Beside a soldier who walked away from death to bet everything on a stranger. And a carpenter who carried him when his own legs gave out, and beside the memory of an old herbalist, who never asked what number was tattooed on a starving boy's arm before offering him shelter. That single act of kindness, unremarkable in the moment it happened, had rewritten the fate of an entire world. Not through magic, not through strength, through knowledge, patience, and the stubborn refusal to let a number decide what was possible. In the end, that was the whole story. Told 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different towns across the Confederation. A boy marked 12 had looked at moldy bread, rough moonshine, and a dying man shallow breathing, and refused to look away. He built an antiseptic from alcohol and herbs when the world had nothing but prayers to offer the sick. He built a painkiller from bark when the world had nothing but bloodletting to offer the suffering. He built an antibiotic from bread mold when the world had nothing but coffins, waiting for the infected. And he built a family from strangers, a widow, an orphan herbalist's daughter, a broken soldier, and a carpenter, when the world had nothing to offer him but a worthless number. Every single one of them had chosen him back, not because of what his mark said he was worth, but because of what he actually did with the hands that Mark tried to define. That, in the end, was the real twist buried inside this whole story. It was never really about a hidden power waiting to be unlocked, or a secret bloodline, or a destiny written somewhere in the stars. It was about a man who refused to wait for permission to matter, and simply started working the very first morning he woke up in this world. The seal on his palm never changed. What changed was everyone standing around him, and eventually, the entire world beneath their feet. If there's one thing worth carrying away from Ethan Cross's story, it's this. Strength was never really the only kind of power that shaped this world. Knowledge, patience, and stubborn kindness rewrote a confederation that had believed for 1,000 years there was only one way to matter. A dying herbalist gave shelter without asking for proof of worth, and that single choice outlived him by generations. A widow trusted a stranger with her only child, and that trust became the foundation stone of an entire movement. A herbalist's daughter picked up a pencil, and became one of the most important minds this world would ever produce. A soldier walked away from a battlefield of the dead, and became the reason thousands more soldiers walked home alive. And a boy marked 12, the weakest number in a world obsessed with strength, became proof that the measure of a person was never really written on their skin. It was written in what they chose to do, every single morning, with whatever hands they happened to wake up with. Somewhere in Lindholm, Barnaby's shop still stands, walls scrubbed clean, shelves still lined with the same jars of mint and sage and white bark. Children in that town grow up hearing the story before they can even read. The tale of an apprentice who saved a whole city with moldy bread. Some of them look down at their own marks, low, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of number the world once told them meant nothing. And some of them, just a few, decide that a number was never going to be the whole story for them either. That's the story of Ethan Cross, the man marked 12 who rewrote what power meant to cross an entire confederation. Not with a sword, not with a fortune, with chemistry, patience, And people who believed in him before the rest of the world ever had a reason to. From a dying old man's one-room shop to a king's own throne room. Every single step of that journey was built on the same simple choice. Do the work. Trust the people willing to stand beside you. Never let a number decide what you're capable of. Barnaby never lived to see any of it, but his final act of kindness became the seed that grew into an entire new age of medicine. Helga never stopped believing that the man who saved her son deserved every ounce of trust she could offer him in return. Lyra never stopped writing, filling shelf after shelf with formulas that would outlive every one of them by centuries. Sora never stopped training soldiers to save each other, carrying forward a knowledge she'd once learned from a stranger in a roadside tavern. Goran never stopped building, quietly proud that a fixed tooth had somehow led him to help change the entire world. And Ethan never stopped waking up each morning and asking the same question that had kept him alive since his very first day in this body. What can I build today with the knowledge no one else here has? To save one more life the world had already given up on. That question, asked and answered day after day for the rest of his life, was the true engine behind everything this story became. Not a hidden bloodline, not a secret destiny, just a man who refused to stop working, surrounded by people who refused to stop believing in him. The number 12, once a verdict, became instead a quiet kind of legend, whispered in towns that had once written him off entirely. Parents began telling their children that a low seal wasn't a sentence. It was simply an unanswered question, waiting for someone stubborn enough to answer it. And in workshops across the Confederation, that answer kept multiplying. One apprentice, one patient, one saved life at a time. The world Ethan woke up and had told him, from the very first morning, that he was worth nothing at all. He spent every day after that morning proving, quietly and completely, exactly how wrong that verdict had been. Not through anger, not through revenge, through work, patience, and an unwavering belief that knowledge belonged to everyone willing to earn it. That belief outlived the Baron who once tried to wrest him, outlived the guild that once tried to shut him down, outlived even the assassins sent to end him. It outlived every single person who had once looked at the number 12 and decided that was the end of Ethan Cross's story. Because it was never the end. It was only ever the very beginning, the lowest point from which everything else had to be built. And build it he did, one impossible night at a time, until an entire world had to rewrite what it thought strength actually meant. This has been the story of a man who woke up at rock bottom, and instead of waiting to be saved, decided to start saving everyone around him instead. A man who turned bread mold into medicine, moonshine into miracles, and a worthless number into the beginning of an entirely new age. Somewhere in a workshop that never stops working, that story is still being written today. One saved life at a time. And it all started with 6 years at a pharmaceutical plant, a dying old man's shop, and a stubborn refusal to accept that rock bottom was permanent. If there's a lesson buried in every twist, every cliffhanger, every impossible night Ethan Cross survived, it's simple enough to carry with you. The number the world hands you at the start was never meant to be the number. That defines how your story ends. Somewhere between a dying herbalist's shop and a king's own throne room, a boy marked 12 proved that beyond any doubt. He proved it with mold, with moonshine, with bark ground into powder by hands too weak to lift a sword. He proved it with people who chose to stand beside him, long before the world gave them a single reason to. And he proved it, most of all, by refusing to stop on the very first impossible night, and on every impossible night that followed it. That refusal, more than any hidden power or secret destiny, was the true engine behind everything Ethan Cross ever built. It carried a dying old man through one more night of breathing. It carried a 5-year-old boy back onto his own feet. It carried a countess's daughter out of a bed everyone else had already given up on. It carried a wounded soldier through a tavern door and into a war that desperately needed her skills. It carried an entire hospital survival rate past anything this Confederation had ever recorded before. It carried a boy marked 12 all the way to a throne room built for men marked 50 and higher. And it carried, in the end, an entire world's understanding of power into something it had never been before. Not measured only in strength, not measured only in seals. Measured, finally, in what a person chose to do with whatever hands they happened to wake up with. Ethan Cross woke up with the weakest hands in the entire world, and used them to rebuild it anyway. That is why his story still gets told in Lindholm and Velmer and Orenhol, and in every small town that once believed a low seal meant nothing at all. Because somewhere in every one of those towns, there's a child looking down at their own low mark, wondering if it means their story is already over. And somewhere, someone is telling them about a boy marked 12 who once believed exactly the same thing, until he decided to prove the world wrong. That belief, passed down from apprentice to apprentice, town to town, became the quiet revolution no army or archbishop ever managed to stop. Not with swords, not with politics, with bottles of antiseptic, jars of ointment, and a stubborn man who refused to accept rock bottom as an ending. The order of pure power had spent 1,000 years insisting that strength was the only truth this world would ever need. One dying herbalist shop, and one refusal to let a boy starve, quietly proved that 1,000 years of certainty could still be wrong. The guild had spent decades deciding who deserved the right to heal, gatekeeping knowledge behind fees no ordinary person could ever afford. One hospital trial, 10 hopeless patients against 10 more, quietly proved that results mattered more than pedigree ever could. The Baron had believed that gold and soldiers were the only leverage that mattered in this world, the only currency worth respecting. 30 townspeople standing silently in front of a shop door proved that trust, earned honestly, could outweigh every soldier he commanded. Every single institution Ethan Cross came up against believed, completely, that the old rules of this world could never actually be challenged. Every single one of them was wrong, not because Ethan fought them directly, but because he simply kept building something better beside them. That, in the end, is the quiet, stubborn heart of this entire story. Not a battle won, not a villain defeated. A better way, built patiently, one saved life at a time. Until the old way simply couldn't compete anymore. Ethan Cross never set out to become a legend. He set out only to keep one dying old man breathing through a single impossible night. Everything else, the workshop, the apprentices, the royal protection, the entire reshaping of what power meant, grew from that one small choice. A choice made by a man with nothing, in a body that wasn't his, in a world that had already decided he was worth nothing at all. He decided otherwise and kept deciding otherwise, every single morning, for the rest of his life. That is the whole story, really. Stripped down past every twist and every cliffhanger to its simplest possible truth. A man given nothing chose to build everything anyway, and refused to stop building it, no matter who tried to take it from him. The Baron tried, and failed. The guild tried, and failed. An assassin in the dark tried, and failed. An archbishop smiling through every lie he told tried, and is still failing. One saved patient at a time. Because the thing none of them ever understood is that you cannot kill an idea by killing the man who first believed it. Lyra believed it, Helga believed it, Sora believed it, Goran believed it, and eventually, an entire confederation believed it too. The idea that a number tattooed on skin was never the whole measure of a person's worth. The idea that knowledge, shared honestly and taught patiently, could outlast any seal, any sword, any 1,000-year-old order built on fear. The idea that rock bottom was never a life sentence, only the lowest point a person could choose to start climbing from. Ethan Cross climbed from that lowest point every single day, until the entire world around him had no choice but to climb along with him. Not because he forced it to, because he simply refused to accept anything less, one dying patient, one impossible night at a time. That is why his shop still stands in Lindholm, walls scrubbed clean, shelves still lined with mint, sage, and white bark, exactly as he left them. That is why children in that town still grow up believing a low seal is only an unanswered question, not a final verdict. That is why an entire confederation eventually learned to measure power and lives saved, instead of numbers tattooed on skin. It started with a dying old man's kindness. It grew through a widow's trust, a girl's pencil, a soldier's courage, and a carpenter's steady hands. And it ended, if a story like this ever truly ends, with a boy marked 12 standing in a king's own throne room, exactly where he belonged. Not because a king allowed it, because Ethan Cross had already earned it, one saved life at a time, long before that throne room ever knew his name. That is the story of the weakest man in the world, who quietly became the reason an entire world learned what strength actually meant. And it began, simply enough, the moment he chose to kneel beside a dying stranger and refused to walk away.